Now here comes an important, what Finkelstein's opinion is essentially the latch key, right, that is going to motivate Israel to actually preemptively attack. It's the fact that basically the vice president of Egypt was sent by Nasser to Washington to engage in a diplomatic resolution to the tensions. And Israel felt like it was worth going to war rather than going through these negotiations, because basically they would, quote, lose the fruits of victory. So here's what Finkelstein says. In late May, right, 7, the UN Secretary General journeyed to Cairo personally to mediate the crisis. His minimum aid was to get both parties to agree to a breathing spell which would allow tension to subside from its present, quote, explosive level and give the Security Council time to deal with the underlying causes and seek solutions. In this spirit, Uthant, right, Secretary General, presented Nasser with a proposal reportedly backed by the United States. Essentially, it called for a 2-week moratorium in the Straits of Tiran, similar to the one that Uthant had arranged during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Israel would refrain from sending and Egypt from inspecting ships, and a renewed effort at diplomacy. A special UN representative would be appointed for the area. Egypt assented, a gesture that Secretary General reckoned as very significant. But the problem was that Israel did not agree to either of these conditions. The rationale adduced by Israel's ambassador was that Egypt was, quote, bent on war. And while he got the motive right, the country was wrong, right? That is, that Israel was bent on war, right? And Brian Urquhart, mentioned above, right, a senior UN official, concluded in his memoir that Israel, no doubt having decided on military action, turned down Uthant's ideas. So it's not already clear, right? In addition to putting soldiers, why is Nasser putting soldiers down there? In addition, because he's also blocked the Straits of Tiran, right? Straits of Tiran, right, leads into Eilat, and Israel's objecting, well, you can't do that, right? Well, still, the United States tried hands at mediation. Robert Anderson, a former Treasury Secretary, and Charles Yost, a retired ambassador, met with Egyptian officials in late May and early June, and a, quote, breakthrough in the crisis, in this negotiator's words, was apparently reached. Nasser indicated that he was open to world court arbitration on the dispute of the Straits of Tiran, and perhaps also accounts, although accounts are very contradictory, to an easing of the blockade that would allow for the passage of oil pending the court's decision. Crucially, the Egyptian leader agreed to send his vice president to Washington by week's end to explore a diplomatic settlement. But the meeting never happened. Israel struck before it could take place. In doing so, it not only preempted negotiations, but broke a pledge given to Johnson at the end of May not to take unilateral action before 2 weeks. Dean Rusk, then Secretary of State, later recalled that between the Egyptian vice president's anticipated trip and Israeli assurances of restraint, the mood in Washington in early June was that we had a good chance to de-escalate the crisis. But the Israeli attack put a stop to that. We were shocked, he said. Angry as hell. Rusk continued in a passage worth quoting full, right? So this is what Finkelstein says, and this is the quote from Dean Rusk. When the Israelis launched the surprise offensive, they attacked on a Monday, knowing that on Wednesday the Egyptian vice president would arrive in Washington to talk about reopening the Strait of Tiran. We might not have succeeded in getting Egypt to reopen the strait, but it was a real possibility. And in fact, there's other reports, right? The Middle East Record, which is a quasi-Israeli publication assembled by the Shiloh Center for Middle Eastern African Studies in Tel Aviv. In its comprehensive synthesis of the June War, the editors observed that a number of facts seem to indicate Abdel Nasser's belief in the possibility of terminating the conflict through diplomacy. And specifically, they point to the display of his willingness to revive this EMAC thing. Remember, the EMAC thing says, well, there's a way we can basically bring in UN peacekeeping troops, right, through this tension. And a suggestion that the issue of navigation through the Straits of Tiran be taken to the International Court of Justice. And his vagueness at the end of May on the exact definition of the materials that were not to be permitted through the Straits to Israel.